Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Education, SOE, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, Distance Education, MID, Second Year, MDE-417 Distance Education, Economic Perspective. Block-1 Economics of Education. Unit-1 Conceptual Foundations.
1.1 Introduction. This is the first block of the course on Distance Education, Economic Perspective, and provides the foundation to the study of economics of distance education with conceptual clarifications. Besides conceptual foundations, clarifications given in Unit 1, the subsequent three deal respectively with education as consumption and investment, various educational costs and cost analysis in education, and how resources are utilized within, for education. With the foundational clarity provided in this block, you will be equipped better to appreciate the detailed study of economics of distance education in Block 2, costing in distance education in Block 3, and international perspectives in Block 4 on costing in distance education, which are contributed by international experts in the area of economics of distance education. And the critical study of select papers given in Block 5 shall expand the horizon of your understanding of this area, as also facilitate you to take up research studies of your own in future, as also for your project work within the master's program. 1.2 Learning Objectives. After going through this unit, you should be able to define economics of education, differentiate between public and private good, investment and consumption goods, and social good and merit good. Explain the human capital theory with a critique on it. Examine the relationship between education and economic growth. Explain the endogenous growth theory. Examine the contemporary economic reform policies and their effects on education, such as privatization and internationalization of education. 1.3 Introduction to Concepts. 1.3.1 What is economics of education? Economics of education is a branch of economics which applies various economic theories, principles and models to the issues and problems of education. Economics of education was born as a formal area of study only about 5 decades ago, with the human investment revolution in economic thought, created by Theodore Schultz in his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1960. It builds powerful interface with theories of growth, labor economics, international economics, public finance, welfare economics, microeconomics, household economics, and simultaneously going deep into the basic tenets of economics of education. To begin with, the interests of economists in the field of education have centered chiefly on 4 topics. A. Measurement of the economic cost and benefits of education. B. Educational planning. C. Efficiency criteria. And D. Adequacy of revenue sources. Further, 3 major economic approaches to educational planning, viz. I. Rate of return analysis. E. Manpower planning. And E. Social demand analysis have vastly contributed to better understanding of several economic dimensions of education. These have also influenced considerably the boundaries of the theories of growth, labor economics, and development economics. Research studies that examined private and social demand for education have made significant dents into development economics, necessitating broadening the framework of studies on poverty, inequality, household consumption, and levels of living. For its own development, economics of education has drawn heavily from economics, and in turn influenced heavily the development of economics too. It has become a specialized branch of economics and also a separate area of educational studies. The other major components of human capital, viz. Health and migration, also branched out of it as important areas of study. 1.3.2 Public good and private good. Public good is a good which has the twin characteristics of non-rivalous and non-excludability nature. In Paul Samuelson's words, public good is good, which all enjoy in common in the sense that each individual's consumption of such a good leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. Public goods are goods or services that can be consumed by several individuals simultaneously without diminishing the value of consumption to anyone. This key characteristic of public goods, that multiple individuals can consume the same good without diminishing its value, is termed as non-rivalry. Non-rivalry characteristic is the one which most strongly distinguishes public goods from private goods. A pure public good also has the characteristic of non-excludability, that is, an individual cannot be prevented from consuming the good whether or not the individual pays for it. For example, fresh air, a public park, national defense. Education, more broadly defined as knowledge or ideas as postulated in the modern growth theories, discussed later, has the inherent nature of non-rivalness, Romer, 1994. On the contrary, private goods are exclusive and rival in nature. Exclusiveness means once the good or service is bought, the buyer owns it and consumes. Rivalness means the competitiveness that is once a good is sold off, it is not there for other people to consume. For example, food, clothing, toys, cars, etc. In the recent periods, education is also argued as a private food, but has immense positive externalities. Externality means the benefits of education that is conferred on the society, which further means the benefit the society receives as the people are educated. Examples include cleanliness, better health practices, etc. Similarly, education has the characteristics of both consumption and investment goods. 1.3.3 Consumption and investment goods. Goods in economics can be categorized as consumption and investment goods. Consumption good or service is one that is used, without using it for further transformation in production, for the direct satisfaction of individual needs or wants or the collective needs of members of the community. Investment good is a good which enables further production of goods, which is also called as capital goods. Capital goods are generally human-made, and do not include natural resources such as land or minerals. For example, plant, machinery, tools, equipments, etc. The nature of education is such that it possesses both consumption and investment characteristics of good. However, since 1960s, education has been recognized as an investment for both the individual and the society. Education is both investment as well as consumption. There is no method of estimating in what proportion these two contribute to education. In primary education, the investment component is lesser than consumption component. In secondary education, both the components may more or less equal, and in the case of higher education, investment benefits are much higher than consumption benefits. Moreover, whether education is a consumption or an investment good needs to be examined from both the private and social point of view. 1.3.4 Social good and merit good. Social goods are distinguished as those goods to which exclusion principle cannot be applied. In other words, it is a good or service that benefits the largest number of people in the largest possible way. Some examples of social goods are clean air, clean water and literacy. Merit good is a socially desirable good whose distribution of benefits is the maximum. In the case of merit goods, people do not realize the true or actual size of benefit. For example, people underestimate the benefits of education, such as the scientific innovations and the benefits of using them, like the benefits of using vaccinations. Activity 1.1. Write, in your own words, brief statements on each of the following with an example for each. I. Public good. E. Investment good. E. Social good. 1.4 Human capital theory. After the conceptual introduction, let us turn to a very important aspect of economics and economics of education, i.e. human capital. The human capital theory postulates that education is an investment activity that increases skills, and hence labor productivity and the lifetime earnings of individuals. Schultz, 1963, Becker, 1964, Mincer, 1974. A simple description of this process is illustrated in Figure 1.1, which depicts that investment on education leads to enhanced skills, which in turn lead to higher productivity, which in turn causes higher earnings. The higher wages and salaries in turn lead to higher economic growth. Investment on enhanced skills, education, higher productivity, higher earnings. Figure 1.1, Process of education as investment. Human capital theory brought out that education is a major source of acquired abilities. It brought out the distinctive attributes of education as human capital distinguishable from that of physical capital. I. The stock of knowledge is embodied in human capital unlike in physical capital. E. In acquiring human capital, the individual must invest both of her time and resources. Another important facet of human capital theory deals with investment in on-the-job training and the criteria for determining who will pay for such training and who will benefit therefrom. Based on the pioneering work of Becker, 1964, a distinction is made between general and specific training. That the accumulation of human capital occurs through both formal instructional programs and through informal ways such as the cumulative experience on a job, in which one learns by doing. General training refers to training that provides valuable knowledge and skills to workers usable both within the present employment and in other employments. On the other hand, specific training has value only within the current employment and is totally irrelevant for the worker's productivity in other firms. The distinction between general skills in terms of portability and specific skills in terms of non-portability are important. The general skills defined in terms of portability have a central place in both learning and at work as parts of an integrated theory of human capital. Applying the criteria who will pay for the cost and who will benefit from what kind of training, general or specific, can result in 4 alternatives as shown in Figure 1.2. The alternatives are the following. I, for general training, would be willing to bear the cost as the benefit is spread over to more than one employment opportunity. B, but, for the employer, it would be an additional cost for no additional benefit. E, for specific training. INVE. A, for the individual, it is an additional cost and the benefit is specific to a particular firm. B, for the employer, it is an additional cost and would bring in additional benefit. Among these 4 alternatives, one can deduce the 2 desirable ones as I, A. The individual would be willing to bear the cost for general training as the benefit is spread over to more than one employment opportunity, and E. B. For the employer, it is an additional cost for a specific training but would be benefiting more from that cost of specific training. Mincer, 1974, applied empirically to separate out the schooling and on-the-job training components of earning streams by the interpretation of the concave shapes of earning paths over a person's life. Hence, the rates of return to education are estimated using the age earnings profile or Mincer's earning function. We will briefly discuss these 2 methods of estimating rates of return to education as follows. 1.4.1 Rates of return approach to education. The economic returns to education can be measured by the internal rate of return to education, which is the interest rate that equates the present value of the costs incurred for education to the present value of additional lifetime earnings attributable to education. It is the profitability or rate of return on investment as a measure of the expected yield of investment in terms of future benefits, or income stream generated by capital compared with the cost of acquiring the capital asset. The rate of returns to education can be measured for both the individual, private, and social rates of returns. The private rate of return is used to explain the demand for education. It can also be used to assess the equity or poverty alleviation effects of public education expenditures, or the incidence of the benefits of such expenditure. The social rate of return summarizes the costs and benefits of the educational investment from the state's point of view, i.e., it includes the full resource cost of education, rather than only the portion that is paid by the recipient of education, i.e., the student or the trainee. Private rate of return. The costs incurred by the individual are his, her foregone earnings, since he, she may have earned in a job if had not gone for further education, while studying, plus any education fees or incidental expenses the individual incurs during schooling. The private benefits amount to what a more educated individual earns, after taxes, above a control group of individuals with less education. The private rate of return to an investment at a given level of education in such a case can be estimated by finding the rate of discount, R, that equalizes the stream of discounted benefits to the stream of costs at a given point in time. Social rate of return. Private and social rate. The main difference between private and social rates of return is that, for a social rate of return calculation, the costs include the state's or society's at large spending on education. Gross earnings, i.e., before taxes and other deductions, is used in a social rate of return calculation, and such earnings also include income in kind where this information is available. Since the costs are higher in a social rate of return calculation relative to the one from the private point of view, social returns are typically lower than a private rate of return. The difference between the private and the social rate of return reflects the degree of public subsidization of education. Adjustments. Estimating the returns to investments in education, as for any other sector, involves an implicit projection of anticipated benefits over the person's or society's lifetime. Since only the past earnings are observed, or, most commonly, only a snapshot of the relative earnings of graduates of different levels of schooling is observed, adjustments have been used in the literature to provide a realistic projection of earnings of graduates. The most common adjustments refer to the anticipated real growth in earnings, mortality, unemployment, taxes and innate ability. Earning function. Mincerian method, or earning function involves the fitting of a function of log wages, using years of schooling, years of labor market experience and its square as independent variables, Mincer, 1974. Often weeks worked or hours worked are added as independent variables to this function as compensatory factors. We call the above a basic earnings function. In this semi-log specification, the coefficient on years of schooling can be interpreted as the average private rate of return to one additional year of schooling, regardless of the educational level this year of schooling refers to. 1.4.2 Education as a screening or credentialism. Hypothesis. Many economists, particularly Arrow, 1973, Spencer, 1973, and Stiglitz, 1975, among many others, have argued that education remained as a screening or filtering device. The skepticism of human capital theories have led to development of alternative theories such as screening theories and labeling mechanisms. This hypothesis contends that education or investment on education is not productive by imparting necessary knowledge and skills, but simply acts as a screening device, which enables employers to identify individuals who possess either superior innate ability or certain personal characteristics such as attitudes towards authority, punctuality, or motivation, etc. Rather, education screens, labels and identifies the higher credentials in people and leads to higher earnings, see figure 1.3. Investment on education leads to higher credentials leads to higher earnings. Figure 1.3, Education and Earnings Relationship. Arrow, 1973, noted in his filter argument that higher education not really adds up to productivity but adds to some information to the extent that it identifies higher credentials in people. However, the screening hypothesis is important as it focused the attention on education and other forms of investment in human capital which influence productivity. It served as a reminder that education does far more than imparting knowledge and skills. The educational process helps to shape and develop those attributes. This restates that the concept of human capital is still valid, that it must be extended to include activities which affect personal attributes as well as skills, and it must recognize that such activities increase workers' productivity in complex ways. 1.5 Education and Economic Growth. The relationship between education and economic growth has been one of the major tenets of economics of education. This relationship has been examined by economists under two theoretical frameworks, i. The growth accounting framework which Solow, Denison and others followed, e. The modern or endogenous growth theories, which Romer, Arrow and Lucas have contributed. These two frameworks are discussed as follows. Works are Rework PSIT. 1.5.1 Growth Accounting Framework. During 1950s, growth had been extraordinarily rapid, and in reflecting on this experience, economists began to recognize what Tinbergen had shown in 1942 itself, that conventionally specified Cobb-Douglas aggregate production functions left a large part of observed growth in national income per capita unexplained. This fact was rediscovered in 1950s in Norway, Finland and in US. The residual was given many designations as technical change, human factor, and measure of ignorance. However, it was generally agreed that education is a vital element in economic development. The discovery that increases in physical capital and labor did not, by themselves, explain economic growth led to an analysis of the factors determining the residual, in particular the role of education and technical knowledge. One of the first attempts to measure the contribution of education to growth was made by Denison, 1964, who argued that about 23% of recent increases in U.S. national income during the period 1929 to 1982 were due to the increased education of the labor force. In Denison's accounting, the effects of scale economies were arbitrarily assumed, and the residuals were simply supposed to reflect the effects of advance in knowledge, with no explanations of how scale economies work and how human knowledge advances. Harrod and Doomer are the earliest exposition of growth models. The rate of growth in the economy is determined by the ratio of rate of savings, S, to capital output ratios. 5. The assumption made in the first 5-year plan in India was that rate of savings is equal to investment in the economy, which is not necessarily the case. If the rate of growth is lower, it results in cumulative unemployment. It is important to recognize that the strategy to promote economic growth by forced savings was based on the assumption of a special production function. The peculiar nature of this production function is evident from the specification that only capital but not labor is included as a factor of production. It also assumes that labor and capital are not substitutable in production and hence output does not increase by applying more output for given stock of capital. The warranted rate of growth is referred as knife edge, and it is also the unstable growth path. The dynamic question on how fast the economy should grow is not addressed in the model. This model does not concern about how the variation in growth rate occurs across space and time. Using the neoclassical production function, Solow and Swan in 1956 advance a very different perspective from the Harrod-Doomer model on the relationship between capital accumulation and economic growth. Unlike in Harrod-Doomer, the labor and capital ratios were allowed to change by Solow and Swan. It can be derived from this model that both capital input per worker and output continue to grow at the same rates as the rate of increase in the efficiency of labor resulting from technological progress. Thus, it implies that the growth of income per capita cannot be sustained without continuous technological progress. However, Solow's convergence keeps on growing at the same rate and does not allow for any difference across space or time as in Harrod-Doomer. An important contribution of the neoclassical growth model of Solow-Swan was to elucidate the decisive role of technological change in economic growth. However, the problem was treating technological progress as exogenous in the growth model. 1.5.2 Endogenous Growth Theory. The PEC. An attempt to incorporate the effects of scale economies and endogenous technological progress into the growth theory is called endogenous growth models, pioneered by Paul Romer, 1986, 1994, Kent Arrow, 1973, and Robert Lucas, 1988. These models try to explain the mechanism of how new knowledge is created through economic activities, giving rise to scale economies. Its basic assumption is that new knowledge to improve economic production accentuates bit by bit through the efforts of individual firms to design and construct more efficient machines and factories in their investment activities. It is assumed that certain useful knowledge created by a firm sooner or later becomes usable by other firms despite the firm's efforts to prevent other firms from using it. According to Romer, an inherent characteristic of ideas or such knowledge is that they are non-rivalrous. But they vary substantially in their degree of excludability. Excludability indicates the degree to which a good is excludable, i.e., the degree to which the owner of the good can charge a fee for its use. As discussed earlier, non-rivalrous goods that are essentially non-excludable are called public goods. On the contrary, a rivalrous good must be produced each time they are sold. Goods that are non-rivalrous need to be produced only once. That is, non-rivalrous goods such as ideas involve a fixed cost of production and zero marginal cost. An example is Thomas Edison and his lab to produce the first commercially viable electric light. Additional lights could be produced at a much lower per unit cost. Once the product is developed, each additional unit is produced with increasing returns to scale under imperfect competition. This process can be viewed as production with a fixed cost and a constant marginal cost, which exhibits increasing returns to scale. See figure 1.4. Ideas are very different from other economic goods. Ideas are non-rivalrous and also non-excludable after some time, at least in the medium term. Once an idea is invented, it can be used by one person or by 1,000 people, at no additional cost. That the size of the economy its scale plays an important role in the economics of ideas. Ideas. Non-rival. Increasing returns. Imperfect competition. Figure 1.4. The process in endogenous growth. In particular, the non-rivalry of ideas implies that production will be characterized by increasing returns to scale. In turn, the presences of increasing returns suggest that we must move away from models of perfect competition. It is because the inventor expects to be able to charge a price greater than marginal cost and earn profits. It is important to understand that the technical progress in machines and equipments is embodied, whereas in labor it is disembodied. In the production function of goods and services, the constant returns to scale operate, whereas in the stock of knowledge function the increasing returns to scale operates. However, the rate of knowledge accumulation depends upon the initial stock of knowledge. Higher the stock of knowledge, the more one can add to it. This proposition gets accentuated under the contemporary economic policies. 1.6 Contemporary economic reform policies and their effects on education. Knowledge is the driving force in the rapidly changing globalized economy and society. Quantity and quality of highly specialized human resources determine their competence in the global market. It is now well recognized that the growth of the global economy has increased opportunities for those countries with good levels of education and vice versa. Carnoy, 1999. Stewart, 1996. It is also widely recognized that to the extent globalization and macroeconomic reforms intensify competitive pressures, it correspondingly emphasizes the redistributive strategies and push governments away from equity-driven reforms. Bowles, 2001. India is no exception to this global phenomenon. As a part of globalization, economic reforms initiated in India in the beginning of 1990s consisting of structural adjustment and stabilization policies. Further, the second generation of economic reform policies, especially the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management (FRBM) Act, notified on August 2003, aims to eliminate the revenue deficit by 2008-09. With economic reforms and other pressures of the government, higher education has been listed as non-merit good. Following the structural adjustment policies and later the macroeconomic and fiscal policies, a fiscal squeeze is experienced in all social sector investments, which has trickled down to public expenditure on education in general, and higher education in particular. Economic reforms initiated in India in the beginning of 1990s consist of structural adjustment and stabilization policies. Following the structural adjustment policies, a fiscal squeeze is experienced in all social sector investments, which has trickled down to public expenditure on education in general, and higher education in particular. On account of the cut in the budget for higher education, there are severe pressures for the higher education system to mobilize resources from non-governmental resources. Simultaneously, the demand for higher education has been growing rapidly with comparatively faster growth in enrollment in higher educational institutions than the growth in number of higher educational institutions. On account of the cut in the budget for higher education, there are severe pressures for the higher education system to mobilize resources from non-governmental resources. As a consequence, augmentation of resources by higher educational institutions covering either a larger portion of cost of higher education or full cost recovery even in public higher education institutions has become the order of the day through introduction of self-financing courses and seats in tune with liberalization policies. The emerging alternatives on various financial reforms, innovations. It pertains to public higher educational institutions. However, there is no comprehensive information available on growth of private higher educational institutions and number of students enrolled therein. Certain number of students in each department pay full cost fee, while the rest of the students pay normal, subsidized, fees. It is to be noted that the normal fee itself has been increasing, besides the full cost fees. Including hike in student fees, student loans and privatization in public higher education institutions along with increasing private sector participation. 1.6.1 Privatization of education. Private higher education is one of the most dynamic and the fastest growing segments of post-secondary education at the turn of the 21st century. A combination of unprecedented demand for access to higher education and the inability or willingness of governments to provide the necessary support has brought private higher education to the forefront. Private institutions, with a long history in many countries, are expanding in scope and number, and are increasingly important in parts of the world that have relied on the public sector. Altbach, 1999. This transition process in higher education is primarily on account of the new goals, policies, and practices of neoliberal market principles. There has been a paradigm shift in the attitude towards the role and efficiency of state per se and financing of any public services, including education, in particular. India is no exception to this global transformation, especially during 1990s. Historically, private sector participation in education in India is not a new phenomenon. In India, over the years, there have been private initiatives in education initially for philanthropic reasons and more intensively during 1990s, in professional and even in general higher education, not only to meet the growing demands but also to realize the huge and quick profit potential. Such a rapid growth of private higher education institutions is also on account of the policy changes at the macroeconomic level and also at the micro or subsectoral level, i.e. higher education. This is primarily the impact of economic reforms initiated during the beginning of 1990s. The five major components of the new economic policy initiated in the beginning of 1990s include liberalization, globalization, privatization, called LGP, currency convertibility, and reduced role of state. These reform packages imposed a heavy compression on the public budgets on education sector, more specifically so on higher education, see figure 1.5. With macroeconomic reforms leading to severe cuts on the education budget resulted in several policy directions. Such policy changes have paved way to several alternatives, including student fees, student loans and privatization in higher education. The increased role of market is manifested by the expansion of private sector education industry, i.e. marketization. 1.6.2 Internationalization of education. Until late 1980s, education was thought to be essentially a non-traded service. Under General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, in January 1995, education has become a tradable service. Since then, internationalization of higher education gained momentum. Internationalization of higher education is seen as one of the ways the country responds to globalization, while maintaining the individuality of the nation. Knight, 2002, defines internationalization of higher education as the process of integrating an international, intercultural dimension into the teaching, research and service functions of the institutions. There are several key concepts in this definition, e.g., the idea of internationalization being a dynamic process and not a set of isolated activities. Integration or infusion contributes to the sustainability of the international dimension. Finally, the definition refers to the primary and universal functions of an institution of higher education, namely teaching, research and service to the nation. Internationalization of higher education is pursued via four modes, see Table 1. The first important mode, cross-border supply, corresponds to the normal form of trade in goods and service which crosses the border. Cross-border supply of educational services might grow rapidly in the future through the use of new information technologies for distance learning, cable and satellite transmissions, audio and video conferencing, PC software, CD-ROMs, and the Internet. In particular, the Internet is seen as a promising tool for distance learning. A number of private companies and universities have launched recent initiatives in this area. The second mode of consumption abroad refers to a situation where a service consumer moves to another country to obtain the service in question, e.g., a student who travels abroad to study. International flows of students in higher education constitute at present by far the largest share of the global market for education services. The third mode of commercial presence of educational services refers to the commercial establishment of facilities abroad by education providers, e.g., local branch campuses, or partnerships with domestic educational institutions. There is a growing interest through this mode and has a strong potential for growth. The last mode of presence of natural persons consists of a natural person, e.g., professor, researcher, teacher etc., traveling to another country on a temporary basis to provide an educational service, see Table 1.1. Under GATS, there are both conditional and unconditional obligations, see Knight, 2002. These obligations in a broader sense favor the developed nations than the developing nations. In brief, we can say that it makes a similar platform for unequal partners and hence poses many challenges for the developing nations. For instance, in India, many foreign universities and institutions have been allowed to come into the country and establish franchise centers in the country, offering degrees or diplomas, which are not necessarily recognized by the parent universities in their own countries. The regulatory framework in developing countries is yet to be developed or even if exists, is yet to be strengthened. 1.7 Summary. You have learnt what is meant by economics of education, that it is a branch of economics evolved during 1960s, but an area growing tremendously. You also understood some key and basic concepts of the subject such as investment and consumption goods, human capital versus physical capital, and public good, merit good, etc. Further, you learned how education contributes to the economic growth under two streams of studies, one focusing on human capital theory and the recently developed endogenous growth theories. With this basic foundation knowledge, you would have appreciated the contemporary economic reform policies and their effects on education, especially on privatization of education and internationalization of education. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.